A little beggar girl appears at the door of a mansion and shouts, "Do you remember me, Daddy?" The millionaire is in disbelief and denies everything, but the days ahead are full of surprises. The imposing iron gates of the Harrison mansion stood like silent guardians against the gathering storm clouds. Through the bars, 10-year-old Sarah Matthews stared at the sprawling estate, her small fingers clutching a worn silver locket. The wind whipped through her threadbare jacket, but determination burned in her eyes, warming her against the autumn chill. "Are you sure about this, miss?" Thomas, the elderly groundskeeper, asked softly. He had found her earlier that morning, huddled near the service entrance, and something in her earnest face had touched his heart. "Mr. Harrison doesn't take kindly to unexpected visitors." Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on the locket. "I have to try," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. "She would have wanted me to." The groundskeeper hesitated, then pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Harrison, sir, there's someone here to see you." Inside the mansion, Maxwell Harrison glanced up from his morning paper, irritation creasing his forehead. At 55, he had built an empire that spanned continents, and his time was too valuable for uninvited guests. His wife, Victoria, perfectly coiffed even at this early hour, raised an eyebrow from her seat across the breakfast table. "Who could it be at this hour?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of displeasure. Before Maxwell could respond, Thomas's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Sir, it's a young girl, says she needs to speak with you urgently." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her coffee cup. "A child? Really, Maxwell, this is becoming absurd. The help simply cannot keep allowing every vagrant who wanders by to disturb our morning." Maxwell sighed, setting down his paper. "I'll handle this myself." He stood, straightening his silk robe. "Perhaps it's time we reviewed our security protocols." As he strode through the marble halls of his mansion, Maxwell Harrison felt secure in his position. He had weathered corporate takeovers, market crashes, and countless attempts to tear down his empire. A child at his gates was hardly cause for concern. The security monitor showed a small figure standing beside Thomas, and something about her posture, the way she held herself perhaps, tugged at a distant memory. Maxwell dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. He pressed the intercom button. "Young lady, I'm afraid we don't—" "Please," Sarah's voice carried through the speaker, clear and unwavering. "I just need 5 minutes. I have something important to show you." Maxwell's finger hovered over the button to dismiss her, but that nagging feeling returned, stronger now. Against his better judgment, he buzzed the gate open. "Thomas, escort her to my study." Victoria appeared in the doorway, her silk robe rustling. "Maxwell, surely you're not serious. We have the charity gala planning meeting in an hour." "This won't take long," he assured her, though uncertainty had begun to creep into his voice. Sarah followed Thomas through the mansion's grand foyer, her worn sneakers silent against the marble floors. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Harrisons captured in gilt frames, their eyes seeming to follow her progress. She clutched her backpack closer, feeling the weight of its precious contents. Maxwell Harrison was waiting in his study, standing before floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the manicured grounds. He turned as Sarah entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Now then, young lady, what was so urgent that—" The words died in his throat as Sarah pulled out the silver locket. His face paled slightly, though he quickly recovered his composure. Victoria, who had followed them into the study, noticed the change in her husband's demeanor. Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she opened the locket, revealing a small photograph within. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, holding it up. Maxwell's eyes fixed on the image, a much younger version of himself, smiling beside a beautiful woman with Sarah's eyes, the same woman who had worked in this very house 12 years ago, whose sudden departure had been carefully scrubbed from the household records. "Remember me, Daddy." Sarah's words hung in, the air like thunder before a storm. The study fell into a silence so complete that Sarah could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Victoria's perfectly composed facade cracked for just a moment, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Maxwell Harrison stood, frozen, his eyes locked on the locket that had haunted his dreams for over a decade. "This is preposterous," Victoria finally broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Maxwell, surely you're not going to entertain this obvious attempt at extortion." But Maxwell barely heard his wife. His mind had transported him back 12 years, to stolen moments in the garden with Elena Matthews, to whispered promises and desperate pleas, to the night everything changed, when he had made a choice that would shape more lives than he could have imagined. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice rougher than he intended. Sarah stood her ground, though her heart hammered in her chest. "My mother gave it to me before she had to leave. She told me to keep it safe until I was old enough to understand." She reached into her backpack again, pulling out a worn envelope. "She also gave me this." Victoria swept forward, her silk robe swishing against the Persian carpet. "This is absurd. Maxwell, call security immediately. This child is clearly part of some scheme." "Let her speak," Maxwell interrupted, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. Something about the girl's eyes, Elena's eyes, kept him rooted to the spot. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, extracting a letter written in familiar, flowing script. "Dear Mr. Harrison," she began reading, her young voice steady despite the weight of the words. "If you're reading this, then our daughter has finally found the courage I never had." Victoria's sharp intake of breath echoed through the study. Maxwell sank into his leather chair, the carefully constructed walls of his world beginning to crack. "That's quite enough," Victoria announced, reaching for the letter. But Thomas, who had remained quietly by the door, stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrison," he said softly, "perhaps we should let the child finish." Victoria turned on him, eyes flashing. "You forget your place, Thomas. You've worked here for 30 years. "Exactly, ma'am," Thomas interrupted gently. 30 years. Long. Enough to remember when Miss Elena worked here. Long enough to remember everything. Maxwell's head snapped up at that, really looking at Thomas for the first time. The old groundskeeper met his gaze steadily, years of unspoken knowledge passing between them. Sarah continued reading, her voice gaining strength. "I never asked you for anything, not even when you sent me away. But our daughter deserves to know her father, to understand where she comes from. The money you gave me to stay quiet has run out, and I'm not well. Sarah needs someone to care for her, to give her the opportunities I never could." Victoria's face had gone pale, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "Maxwell," she whispered, "tell me this isn't true." But Maxwell Harrison was lost in memory, remembering the day he'd given Elena that locket, the day he'd promised her the world, the day before Victoria's father had threatened to pull his crucial investment unless Maxwell ended the relationship immediately. "There's more," Sarah said, pulling out another piece of paper. "Medical records proving when I was born and—" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "And a letter from my mother's doctor explaining why she can't be here herself." Thomas moved closer to Sarah, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. In the 30 years he'd worked for the Harrisons, he'd kept many secrets. But watching this brave little girl stand her ground, he knew some secrets were meant to be revealed. Maxwell finally found his voice. "Victoria, please leave us." When his wife started to protest, he held up his hand. "Please, I need to speak with Sarah alone." Victoria's eyes darted between her husband and the girl who threatened everything she'd built. "Very well," she said finally, her voice brittle. "But this isn't over." She swept from the room, but not before casting a warning glance at Thomas. As the door closed behind her, Maxwell Harrison stood and walked to the window, his empire spread out before him. But for the first time in years, he wasn't seeing the carefully manicured grounds or the symbols of his wealth. He was seeing Elena's smile, hearing her laugh, feeling the weight of choices made and paths not taken. Victoria Harrison's heels clicked sharply against the marble floors as she strode toward her private sitting room, her composure cracking with each step. Once inside, she pressed a perfectly manicured finger to her intercom. "Margaret, get me Robert Sullivan immediately." Within minutes, Her phone buzzed. Robert Sullivan, the family's longtime private investigator, listened carefully as Victoria outlined the situation. "I need everything you can find on Elena Matthews and her daughter," she commanded, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Every detail, every connection, every possible weakness in their story." Meanwhile, in Maxwell's study, Sarah sat perched, on the edge of a leather armchair that seemed to swallow her small frame. Thomas had reluctantly left them alone, but not before giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Maxwell stood by his desk, examining the medical records with trembling hands. "Your mother," he began, his voice hoarse. "She's in Sacred Heart Hospital," Sarah finished. "She's been there for 3 months now. The doctors say—" Her voice wavered for the first time. "They say she needs special treatment, but we can't afford it." Maxwell closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Elena's laugh echoing through these very halls, her dreams of becoming a writer, the way she'd looked at him with such trust. The trust he'd betrayed. "Why now?" he asked, finally meeting Sarah's steady gaze. "After all these years?" Sarah pulled another item from her backpack, a worn journal with pages marked by colorful tabs. "Mum kept this. She wrote in it every day, even in the hospital. She wanted me to understand everything." She hugged the journal to her chest. "But there are parts that don't make sense, like why she left so suddenly, or why she cries when she talks about someone named James." Maxwell's head snapped up at the mention of that name, color draining from his face. In the depths of his mind, a door he'd kept firmly locked for years threatened to burst open. Outside the study, Victoria was already setting her plans in motion. "I want 2 security guards posted at Elena's hospital room," she instructed Sullivan. "No one gets in or out without our knowledge, and find out everything you can about this James person. There must be something we can use." Back in the study, Sarah's voice grew stronger. "Mum always said you were a good man who made bad choices. She said sometimes people get trapped by their own success, like birds in a golden cage." She looked around the opulent room. "Is that what happened to you?" Maxwell sank into his chair, the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on him. "Your mother was always too kind," he said softly. "The truth is more complicated. There were circumstances, people involved who—" A sharp knock interrupted him. Victoria stepped back into the study, her composure fully restored. "Maxwell, the board members are waiting for our conference call. It's about the Singapore merger." Maxwell checked his watch, torn between his corporate obligations and the daughter he'd never known. Sarah stood, shouldering her backpack. "I can come back," she said, sounding older than her years. "I'm staying with Mrs. Chen at the Golden Dragon restaurant on 5th Street. She lets me help in the kitchen sometimes." "Absolutely not," Victoria interjected smoothly. "If what you say is true, and that's still to be determined, we can't have Maxwell Harrison's daughter living above a restaurant. You'll stay here in one of the guest rooms while we sort this out." Both Maxwell and Sarah stared at Victoria in surprise. Thomas, who had reappeared in the doorway, narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Margaret will show you to your room," Victoria continued, pressing the intercom. "And tomorrow, we'll begin properly investigating these claims of yours." As Sarah followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, Thomas lingered behind. He watched Victoria pull out her phone again the moment Sarah was out of sight. Years of service had taught him to read the subtle signs of his employer's intentions. Something in Victoria's too-perfect smile set off warning bells. In her new room, Sarah stood at the window, looking out over the sprawling grounds. The same gardens where her mother had once walked, dreamed, and loved. She opened the journal again, finding the page she'd memorized. "My dearest Sarah, there are secrets in this house that even I don't fully understand. But I know that somewhere in these walls lies the truth about everything. About James, about your father, and about why I had to leave. Be careful, my brave girl. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well." As night fell over the Harrison mansion, 4 people lay awake, each wrestling with their own demons. Maxwell, drowning in memories he couldn't escape. Victoria, plotting in her private study. Thomas, writing a letter to an old friend who had witnessed everything all those years ago. And Sarah, holding her mother's locket, whispering a promise, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Dawn broke over the Harrison estate, painting the manicured gardens in shades of gold. Sarah woke to the unfamiliar softness of Egyptian cotton sheets, momentarily disoriented by the opulent surroundings. The events of yesterday crashed back like a wave, the confrontation, the letter, Victoria's unexpected offer. A soft knock at the door revealed Margaret, the stern-faced housekeeper. "Mrs. Harrison requests your presence for breakfast in 30 minutes, she announced, laying out a brand new outfit on the bed. She took the liberty of having some proper clothes delivered. Sarah ran her fingers over the expensive fabric, thinking of her mother's careful mending of their second-hand clothes. "Thank you, but I have my own." "Mrs. Harrison insists," Margaret cut her off, though her eyes softened slightly. "And Miss, a word of advice? In this house, it's best to pick your battles carefully." Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her private study, reviewing Robert Sullivan's preliminary findings. "Eleanor Matthews," she read aloud, "former employee terminated 12 years ago. No criminal record, no suspicious financial activity." She frowned. "Dig deeper, Robert. Everyone has secrets." "There is one thing," Sullivan's voice crackled through the speaker. "The friend she's been staying with, Mrs. Chen, turns out she worked here too back then, left shortly after Elena did." Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Now that's interesting. And James?" "Still searching, but there's something odd. All personnel records from that period show signs of being altered. Someone went to great lengths to erase certain names." In the garden, Thomas worked methodically, his weathered hands tending to the roses Elena had once loved. His letter from last night lay sealed in his pocket, waiting. As he worked, he watched Maxwell pacing in his study through the window, a habit he'd developed during times of stress. Sarah descended the grand staircase in her new clothes, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She found the family in the breakfast room, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Maxwell sat behind his newspaper, while Victoria presided over the table like a queen holding court. "Ah, Sarah," Victoria smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Much better. A proper appearance is crucial in our position. Now we have a busy day ahead. The family doctor will be here at 10 to conduct a DNA test." Maxwell lowered his paper sharply. "Victoria, we didn't discuss—" "Of course we must verify her claims, darling," Victoria cut in smoothly. "It's the responsible thing to do. And Sarah understands, don't you, dear?" Sarah nodded slowly, her mother's warnings echoing in her mind. Under the table, her fingers clutched the locket. "After that," Victoria continued, "we'll need to discuss your education. The local public school simply won't do. I've already called. Brighton Academy." "I'm not leaving my current school," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "My friends are there, and it's close to the hospital where—" "The hospital will no longer be a concern," Victoria smiled. "I've arranged for your mother to be transferred to the Cedar Grove Private Medical Center, the best care money can buy." The fork in Maxwell's hand clattered against his plate. "You did what?" "It's all arranged," Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "The transfer happens today. Surely you don't object to providing the best care possible." Sarah's heart raced. Cedar Grove was 2 hours away. The distance from her mother felt like a physical pain. "I've taken the liberty of having your things collected from Mrs. Chen's," Victoria added. "No need to return there." Thomas, who had entered with fresh flowers for the table, caught Sarah's eye. His slight headshake was almost imperceptible. "Now then," Victoria raised her coffee cup, "shall we discuss the press strategy? We'll need to manage this carefully. Perhaps a heartwarming story about family reconciliation." "No press," Maxwell's voice cracked like a whip. "This stays private, Victoria. No statements, no stories, no photographers." Victoria's smile tightened. "Darling, be reasonable. This will get out eventually. Better to control the narrative." "I said no." Maxwell stood abruptly. "Sarah, would you like to see the library? Your mother, she used to spend a lot of time there." As they left the breakfast room, Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something dark and determined in her eyes. She pulled out her phone, typing quickly, "Sullivan, priority 1, find James, whatever it takes." In the library, Sarah trailed her fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, imagining her mother in this room. Maxwell watched her, seeing Elena's mannerisms in every movement. "Your mother was writing a book," he said softly. "Did she ever finish it?" Sarah shook her head. "She tried, but after we left, she had to work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat." She pulled out her mother's journal, but she never stopped writing. "Everything's in here." Maxwell stared at the journal, knowing it held truths he'd spent years running from. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with messages from the board about the Singapore merger, but for the first time in decades, the empire he'd built felt hollow. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library windows as Sarah explored the vast collection of books. Her fingers stopped at a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice tucked between leather-bound volumes. Something about its weathered spine caught her attention. "That was her favorite," Maxwell said softly, watching Sarah pull the book from the shelf. She would read it during her lunch breaks, sitting right there by the window. As Sarah opened the book, a pressed flower fell from between its pages. The dried rose had maintained a hint of its original color, a deep burgundy that matched the ones Thomas still tended in the garden. Tucked beside it was a small note in her mother's handwriting. "Remember the garden, where truth blooms eternal." Maxwell's breath caught at the sight of Elena's handwriting. "Your mother, she had a way with words that made everything seem magical. She used to leave little notes like that everywhere." "Mr. Harrison," Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "There's something you need to see." He held a tablet displaying a news website. The headline made Maxwell's face pale. "Harrison Industries under investigation. Whistleblower claims surface." Victoria burst into the library, her usual composure cracking. "Maxwell, the board is calling an emergency meeting. They're saying someone has leaked documents about the Singapore merger." Sarah watched the adults' faces, remembering passages from her mother's journal about corporate secrets and whispered conversations. She slipped the book back onto the shelf, but not before tucking the note into her pocket. "I need to handle this," Maxwell said, straightening his tie. "Sarah, please make yourself comfortable. Thomas will show you around the grounds." As Maxwell and Victoria hurried out, Thomas lingered. "Miss Sarah, would you like to see your mother's favorite spot?" "In the garden? The roses are particularly beautiful this time of year." In the garden, Thomas led Sarah to a secluded bench, partially hidden by climbing roses. "Your mother used to come here to write," he said, checking to ensure they were alone. "But also to meet someone who might be able to help you understand what really happened all those years ago." Sarah's heart quickened. "James?" Thomas nodded slowly. James Morrison was Mr. Harrison's best friend and business partner back then. He disappeared around the same time your mother left. The official story was that he'd embezzled company funds and fled the country, but he pulled out an old photograph from his pocket. Some of us knew better. The photograph showed 4 people laughing at what appeared to be a company party. A younger Maxwell, Eleanor, Victoria, and a man Sarah had never seen before. He had kind eyes and stood protectively close to Eleanor. "James was like a brother to Mr. Harrison," Thomas continued, "until he discovered something about the company, something that changed everything. He tried to convince your mother to help him expose the truth, but then..." A sharp voice cut through the air. "Thomas! Mrs. Harrison needs you in the conservatory." Margaret stood at the garden path, her expression unreadable. Thomas quickly tucked the photograph away. "Coming, Margaret." He turned to Sarah. "Be careful who you trust, Miss Sarah, and whatever you do, don't let anyone see your mother's journal." Inside the mansion, Victoria paced her private study while Robert Sullivan delivered his latest findings. "James Morrison's trail goes cold in Switzerland," he reported. "But I found something interesting in Elena Matthews's hospital records. She's been receiving anonymous payments for her medical care." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Trace those payments, and I want to know every visitor she's had in the past year." Meanwhile, Maxwell sat in his office, staring at the investigation notice. The careful walls he'd built around his past were beginning to crumble. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out an old USB drive he'd kept hidden for 12 years. Sarah spent the afternoon exploring the mansion, her mother's journal tucked safely in her backpack. In a dusty corner of the attic, she found boxes of old company records. One label caught her eye: Project Phoenix, 2013, the year her mother left. As she reached for the box, a floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah whirled around to find Margaret, watching her. The housekeeper's usual stern expression was replaced by something softer, almost sad. "Your mother used to hide up here too," Margaret said quietly. "Said she could think better away from prying eyes." She hesitated, then added, "She left something for you, you know. Asked me to keep it safe until you were old enough to understand." Sarah's heart raced. "What was it?" Margaret glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Meet me in the kitchen at midnight, and Sarah, don't tell anyone about this conversation." As sunset painted the mansion in shades of amber and gold, the pieces of a 12-year-old puzzle began to shift. In her room, Sarah read her mother's journal entry from the day before she left. "My dearest Sarah, sometimes the truth isn't in what people say, but in what they desperately try to hide. James knew this, and now so do I." The grandfather clock's chimes echoed through the darkened mansion as Sarah crept down the service stairs toward the kitchen. Each shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every creaking floorboard threatened to reveal her midnight journey. Her mother's journal was clutched tightly to her chest, its pages holding more questions than answers. The kitchen was dark except for a single light above the industrial stove. Margaret stood by the pantry, her usual crisp uniform replaced by a simple house dress. She held a small wooden box, her hands trembling slightly. "I've kept this hidden in my quarters for 12 years, Margaret whispered, glancing nervously at the security camera in the corner. "Your mother made me promise to give it to you if you ever came looking for answers." Sarah reached for the box, but Margaret pulled it back. "Wait, there's something you need to know first. The night your mother left, she wasn't alone. James Morrison was with her, and he was carrying a briefcase full of documents." "Documents about what?" "Project Phoenix." Margaret's voice dropped even lower. "It wasn't just a business venture. It was a cover-up, something so big it could have destroyed everything Mr. Harrison had built. James tried to stop it, tried to make it right, but then a noise from upstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps crossed the floor above them, then faded. "Victoria knows more than she lets on," Margaret continued. "She was different back then, before ambition hardened her heart. She and your mother were friends once, if you can believe it." Sarah's eyes widened. "But she seems to hate me." "Fear does strange things to people," Margaret sighed. Victoria fought her way up from nothing. The thought of losing everything means she finally handed Sarah the box. "Be careful with what you find in here. Knowledge is power, but it can also be dangerous." The box was heavier than it looked. Inside, Sarah found a keycard with the Harrison Industries logo, a USB drive, and a letter addressed to "My darling daughter." "The keycard still works," Margaret explained. "It's for the executive floor at Harrison Tower. James made a copy before he disappeared. Your mother kept it safe all these years." Upstairs, Victoria stood in her study, watching the security feeds on multiple screens. The kitchen camera showed only darkness. She'd never known that Margaret had learned to loop the footage years ago, a trick taught to her by James himself. In his own study, Maxwell stared at an old photo of himself and James at their college graduation. His phone buzzed with a text from Sullivan. "Found something in Switzerland. Morrison's trail leads to a safety deposit box. Contents unknown." Maxwell's hands shook as he poured himself a drink. The Singapore merger investigation was just the beginning. If anyone started digging too deeply into Project Phoenix. Back in the kitchen, Sarah read her mother's letter by the dim stovelight. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you found your way back to where it all began. The keycard will lead you to James's old office. What you find there might help you understand why I had to leave and why James risked everything to expose the truth. There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a worn envelope. "Your mother left this with instructions to give it to Mr. Harrison if anything happened to her. I've never opened it." Sarah stared at the envelope, her mother's elegant handwriting, spelling out for Maxwell. "Open only when you're ready to face the truth." The sound of a car pulling up the driveway startled them both. Through the kitchen window, they saw Robert Sullivan stepping out of a black sedan, carrying a thick folder. "Go," Margaret urged, pushing Sarah toward the service stairs. Victoria can't know you were here, and Sarah—" She caught the girl's arm. "Watch Thomas. He knows more about James than anyone, but he's afraid. Someone's been threatening him." As Sarah hurried back to her room, clutching her precious box, the mansion's shadows seemed to whisper with 12 years of buried secrets. In her mother's journal, a passage stood out. "The truth about Project Phoenix lies in the numbers. James saw it first, the pattern hidden in plain sight. Maxwell could have stopped it, but by then Victoria had woven her web too tightly. Now, James is gone and I'm next. My darling Sarah, forgive me for leaving, but staying would have meant losing everything, including you." The grandfather clock struck 1, its chimes echoing through the halls like a warning. In different corners of the mansion, 4 people lay awake, each holding pieces of a puzzle that had torn lives apart 12 years ago. Sarah with her mother's box of secrets, Maxwell haunted by old betrayals, Victoria plotting in her study, and Margaret finally unburdened of a 12-year promise, but carrying the weight of what was still to come. Dawn had barely broken when Sarah heard the commotion downstairs. Voices carried through the mansion's halls, Victoria orchestrating what sounded like an army of workers. Peering over the balcony, Sarah watched as decorators and caterers streamed through the front door. "The charity gala must go on," Victoria was saying, her voice sharp with authority. "Especially now. We need to show everyone that the Harrison family is stronger than ever." Sarah retreated to her room, pulling out the wooden box Margaret had given her. The Harrison Industries keycard gleamed in the morning light. Her mother's letter had mentioned James's old office, room 4401 on the executive floor. But how could she possibly get there with Victoria watching her every move? The answer came in the form of Thomas, who knocked on her door with breakfast. "Mrs. Harrison asked me to inform you that your new tutor will arrive at 10, he said, loudly, then lowered his voice to a whisper. "The service elevator in the east wing is unwatched. I can get you to Harrison Tower during the gala preparations." 2 hours later, Sarah sat in Maxwell's private study, supposedly working on mathematics problems while the tutor had stepped out. Instead, she was reading her mother's journal entry from the day she discovered the truth about Project Phoenix. The numbers didn't add up. James showed me the real records. Millions diverted through shell companies, environmental reports buried, lives ruined. Maxwell could have stopped it, but Victoria, she knew what exposure would mean. "Sarah?" Maxwell's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway looking tired. "I thought we might talk. About Project Phoenix." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Maxwell's face went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's in Mom's journal. And in those boxes in the attic. The ones from 2013. "You've been in the attic?" His voice sharpened, then softened as he saw her flinch. "Sarah, there are things about that time. Complicated things that a child shouldn't have to understand." "I'm not a child," Sarah said quietly. "And Mom thought I should know the truth. That's why she kept everything. The journal, the key card." She stopped abruptly, realizing her mistake. "Key card?" Maxwell stepped closer. "What key card?" But before Sarah could respond, Victoria swept into the room. "Darling, the caterers need your approval on the menu, and the board members are calling again about the investigation." As Maxwell left reluctantly, Victoria lingered. "Sarah, dear, I've been thinking. Perhaps we should visit your mother together. I've arranged for a car to take us to Cedar Grove this afternoon." Sarah's heart raced. The hospital transfer she'd almost forgotten, but Cedar Grove was hours away from Harrison Tower. Was Victoria suspecting something? "Actually," Thomas appeared in the doorway, "Miss Sarah is needed here. The DNA testing facility called. They need to retake her samples. Apparently there was a processing error." Victoria's perfect smile faltered for just a moment. "How inconvenient." "Well, we'll have to reschedule then." She left, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. "She's having you followed," Thomas whispered once Victoria was out of earshot. "But she doesn't know about the service entrance. Meet me there at 7 when everyone's distracted by the gala preparations." As the day progressed, the mansion transformed into a glittering showcase. Florists arranged elaborate centerpieces. Caterers set up gleaming silver trays, and Victoria directed it all like a conductor leading an orchestra. In his study, Maxwell stared at his computer screen, reading the latest report on the Singapore merger investigation. But his mind kept drifting to Sarah's words about Project Phoenix. He opened his desk drawer, looking at the USB drive he'd kept hidden all these years. James had given it to him the day before he disappeared, saying only, "When you're ready to make things right, the truth is in here." 7 o'clock found Sarah slipping through the mansion's service corridors, her mother's journal, and the wooden box tucked safely in her backpack. Thomas waited by the service elevator, keeping watch while party guests began arriving at the front of the house. "Mr. Sullivan was asking questions about James today," Thomas said as they drove through the darkening city streets. "Victoria's got him digging into everything from that time. But he doesn't know about the hidden safe in James's old office." "Hidden safe?" Thomas nodded. "Behind the bookshelf. James showed it to me once, said it contained evidence that could bring the whole house of cards down. The key card you have. It's not just for the executive floor. It's coded with the safe's electronic lock sequence." Harrison Tower loomed ahead, its upper floors disappearing into the evening fog. As they parked in the service area, Thomas handed Sarah a security badge. "I'm listed as authorized maintenance. Staff, we have 1 hour before the next security sweep." The service elevator hummed as it carried them upward. Sarah clutched her backpack, feeling the weight of 12 years of secrets inside. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes, the truth isn't in what people say, but in what they desperately try to hide. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Sarah as she ran, Thomas's steady footsteps behind her. They'd managed to slip out of the mansion while Victoria was occupied with an urgent call from Sullivan. Now, at nearly midnight, sacred. Heart Hospital's fluorescent lights cast strange shadows on the worn linoleum floors. "Room 412, Thomas panted, checking his phone. "Margaret's stalling Victoria, but we don't have much time." They rounded the corner to find Elena's room empty, the bed stripped bare. Sarah's heart stopped until a nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. "Looking for Mrs. Matthews. They're prepping her for transfer in the West Wing." Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances. The West Wing, where ambulances waited to transport patients. Without a word, they changed direction, racing against time and Victoria's machinations. They found Elena in a small preparation room, already dressed in transfer clothes. Her face lit up at the sight of her daughter, though worry creased her. "Bratty Tassie, Sarah, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Mom, I know everything," Sarah said, catching her breath. "About James being my father, about Project Phoenix, about why you had to leave." Eleanor's face paled. She gripped Sarah's hand, her voice barely a whisper. "You found the USB drive." "Mrs. Matthews," Thomas stepped forward. "Victoria's arranged for your transfer to Cedar Grove, but you need to know, it's not what it seems. The facility, it's owned by one of her shell companies." Elena's eyes widened with understanding. "She's trying to silence me before the board meeting." She turned to Sarah. "In my bag, there's a phone number. A lawyer named Michael Chen, Mrs. Chen's son. He has copies of everything James gathered about Project Phoenix." Sarah retrieved the bag just as footsteps echoed down the hall, the sharp click of expensive heels. Victoria's voice carried through the door. "The transfer papers are in order. We're moving her tonight." Thomas quickly locked the door, but they all knew it would only buy them minutes. Elena grabbed Sarah's shoulders, her voice urgent. "Listen carefully. James didn't just disappear, he left a trail. The safe deposit box in Switzerland? Victoria doesn't know, but I have the key. It's been hidden all these years in the one place she'd never look." "Where?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding as someone rattled the door handle. "The garden roses," Eleanor smiled weakly. "James's final message to me, truth blooms eternal. The key is in the base of the stone planter, the one where he first told me he loved me." Victoria's voice cut through the door. "Security, open this door immediately." Elena pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small, worn photo. It showed James holding a newborn Sarah, his eyes full of love and fear. "He wanted to stay," Elena whispered, "but exposing Project Phoenix was the only way to ensure you'd be safe. Victoria, She has connections to people who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. The door handle rattled more insistently. Thomas braced himself against it, but his strength was no match for the security team they could hear assembling outside. "Mrs. Matthews," Thomas said quickly. "There's a service elevator at the end of this hall. I can hold them off long enough." "No," Elena interrupted, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard in years. "I'm tired of running." She pulled out her phone, dialing with shaking fingers. "Michael, it's time. Release everything to the board, all of it." Victoria's voice turned sharp with panic. "Eleanor, don't do anything rash. We can talk about this." But Elena was already handing Sarah a final envelope. "Give this to Maxwell. It's not just about Project Phoenix. It's about who Victoria really is and why she's desperate to keep the past buried." The door burst open. Victoria stood in the threshold, her perfect composure cracking as she took in the scene. Behind her, Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Elena and the phone in her hand. "It's done," Elena said calmly, meeting Victoria's gaze. "The board will have everything by morning. James's evidence, the real story behind Project Phoenix, and the truth about what happened 12 years ago." Victoria's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, rage, and finally, something that looked almost like fear. "You have no idea what you've done," she whispered. In the distance, sirens wailed. Sarah clutched the envelope, her father's photo, and years of buried truths. The night stretched before them, full of promises and threats, as the carefully constructed lies of the past began to unravel. Thunder rolled across the city, promising a storm. In different corners of the night, people moved like chess pieces. Maxwell in his study, staring at his own copy of the USB drive. Mrs. Chen calling her son the lawyer. Board members receiving urgent messages about an emergency meeting. And in a hospital room past midnight, 3 generations of secrets began to crack like ice in spring, revealing the dark waters beneath. Dawn broke over the city as Maxwell Harrison stood in his study, watching rain lash against the windows. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since midnight, board members demanding answers, reporters seeking comments, lawyers requesting urgent meetings. But it was the email from Michael Chen that had shaken him to his core. "All evidence regarding Project Phoenix has been submitted to the board," the message read. "Elena's testimony will be presented at 9 a.m. It's time to choose sides, Mr. Harrison." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Thomas entered, his usual composed demeanor marked by exhaustion. "Sir, you should know. Miss Sarah and Elena are safe. They're with Mrs. Chen." Maxwell sank into his leather chair, the weight of 12 years of choices pressing down on him. "I should have listened to James," he whispered. "He tried to warn me about Victoria's connections, about what Project Phoenix really meant." "It's not too late to make things right," Thomas said, placing a worn envelope on the desk. "Eleanor asked Sarah to give you this. She said it explains everything about Victoria's past, about why she was so desperate to keep Project Phoenix buried." As Maxwell reached for the envelope, Victoria burst into the study. Her designer outfit couldn't hide the wild look in her eyes. "The board is gathering for an emergency meeting," she announced. "Sullivan's tracked James's safe deposit box to a bank in Geneva. If we act now, enough." Maxwell's voice cut through the room like steel. "No more schemes, Victoria. No more lies." He held up the envelope. "Elena's given us a chance to face the truth. All of it." Victoria's face went pale as she recognized Elena's handwriting. "You don't understand what's at stake," she whispered. "If those documents become public, then what?" Sarah's voice made them all turn. She stood in the doorway, her father's photo clutched in one hand, her mother's journal in the other. "What are you so afraid of, Victoria? That people will learn how you orchestrated James's disappearance, or that they'll discover who you really were before you married Maxwell?" The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows like nature's own accusation. Victoria's perfect facade cracked, revealing glimpses of someone else beneath. Someone who had clawed her way up from darkness, someone who would do anything to keep from falling back. "You think you know everything," Victoria's voice trembled. "You found James's USB drive, read Elena's journal, uncovered Project Phoenix. But you don't know what it's like to have nothing, to be nothing, to rebuild yourself from ashes. Then tell us, Maxwell said softly. Tell us the truth, Victoria. About who you were before we met, about your connection to the people behind Project Phoenix. Victoria moved to the window, her reflection fragmenting in the rain-streaked glass. My real name, she began, her voice barely audible, is Claire Foster. I was nobody, worse than nobody. My father worked for the men who would later fund Project Phoenix. He knew their secrets, kept their books. When he threatened to expose them, they made him disappear. Sarah's breath caught. In her mother's journal, she'd read about Victoria's obsession with control, with maintaining the perfect image. Now she understood why. I changed my name, erased my past, Victoria continued. Built myself into someone powerful enough to never be vulnerable again. When James started investigating Project Phoenix, he didn't just uncover environmental crimes. He found the connection to my father's disappearance. He discovered who I really was. Maxwell stood slowly, realization dawning. That's why you were so desperate to stop him, not to protect the company, but to protect your identity. The men behind Project Phoenix, Victoria's voice hardened. They don't just make people disappear, they destroy everything. Families, legacies, lives. I thought if I helped them contain James's investigation, they'd leave us alone. Leave me alone. Thunder cracked overhead as Sarah stepped forward. But they didn't, did they? They kept their hold over you, using your fear to control Harrison Industries through you. Victoria turned, tears streaming down her face. Your father was a good man, Sarah. He tried to help me, tried to convince me to join him in exposing everything. But I couldn't. I couldn't face becoming nothing again. The sound of cars pulling up outside drew them to the window. Board members were arriving early, their black umbrellas dotting the driveway like crows before a storm. Among them, Sarah spotted Mrs. Chen and her son Michael, carrying briefcases heavy with 12 years of buried truths. In her mother's journal, one passage suddenly made sense. The biggest prison is the one we build ourselves brick by brick, with our own fears. Victoria had built her walls so high she'd trapped herself inside them. Maxwell picked up his phone, his decision made. I'm calling an emergency press conference. It's time to tell the whole story. About Project Phoenix, about James, about everything. Maxwell, please, Victoria whispered, but the fight had drained from her voice. Sarah looked at the photo of James holding her as a baby, at the love and determination in his eyes. Somewhere in Switzerland, a safe deposit box held the final pieces of the puzzle. But here, in this rain-lashed study, the truth was finally breaking free. The Harrison Industries boardroom hummed with tension as Elena Matthews finished her testimony. Through the wall of windows, lightning illuminated the city skyline, nature providing dramatic punctuation to her revelations. Board members sat in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from shock to outrage. And so, Eleanor concluded, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, Project Phoenix wasn't just about environmental violations. It was about power, corruption, and the lengths people will go to bury their past. Sarah sat between her mother and Mrs. Chen, watching Victoria's carefully constructed world crumble. The former queen of Harrison Industries had aged years in hours, her designer outfit and perfect makeup unable to hide the defeated slump of her shoulders. Maxwell stood at the head of the table, his own testimony having confirmed everything. The cover-up, James's discoveries, the role of Victoria's past in it all. We have a responsibility, he addressed the board, not just to our shareholders, but to the communities affected by Project Phoenix, to the people we've harmed through our silence. Michael Chen, Mrs. Chen's son, spread documents across the table. The evidence is irrefutable, he stated. James Morrison documented everything before his disappearance. The toxic waste dumping, the bribes, the connections to organized crime, and the true identity of Victoria Harrison, formerly Claire Foster. Victoria flinched at her old name. You don't understand, she whispered. They'll come for all of us now. No, came a voice. From the doorway. They won't. Every head turned to see Robert Sullivan enter, carrying a thick folder. Mrs. Harrison, Miss Foster, hired me to investigate James Morrison's disappearance. But what I found instead was evidence of her father's fate. The men behind Project Phoenix, they're not as untouchable as they once were. He placed photos on the table, surveillance images showing arrests, federal agents raiding offices. While we were all focused on Harrison Industries, a joint task force has been dismantling their operation. They just needed the final pieces of evidence, the ones James hid in Switzerland. Victoria's eyes widened. The safe deposit box was opened this morning, Sullivan confirmed. James arranged for its contents to be released if certain conditions were met. Elena's testimony was the final trigger. Sarah reached for her mother's hand as Sullivan continued. Everything's there. The original Project Phoenix documents, proof of Victoria's father's fate, and evidence linking the organization to dozens of similar operations worldwide. There's something else, Elena added softly. She pulled out a letter, its paper yellowed with age. James left this for you, Victoria. He found the truth about your father weeks before he disappeared. He wanted to help you break free from their control. Victoria's hands trembled as she took the letter. As she read, tears fell freely, smudging her perfect makeup. He knew, she whispered. He knew, and he still tried to save me, even after what I'd done. Maxwell moved to stand by the windows, watching the storm begin to clear. We can't change the past, he said, but we can choose how we face the future. He turned to Sarah. Your father was the bravest man I've ever known. He saw wrongs and tried to right them, no matter the cost. The board chairman cleared his throat. Given these revelations, we have no choice but to launch a full investigation. Mr. Harrison, we'll need your complete cooperation. You'll have it, Maxwell assured him, and more. I'm announcing my immediate resignation as CEO. It's time for new leadership untainted by past mistakes. Victoria stood shakily. I'll resign as well. And... She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. I'll testify about everything. About my father. About the organization, about what really happened to James. Sarah opened her mother's journal to its final entry, written just days ago. The truth doesn't always bring justice, but it does bring freedom. Freedom from lies, from fear, from the chains we forge in darkness. As board members filed out to face waiting reporters, Sarah watched Victoria approach her mother. The two women who had once been friends, torn apart by secrets and fear, stood in awkward silence. Eleanor, Victoria began, I know I can never undo what I've done, but James was right about one thing. The past only has power over us if we let it. Elena's response was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing. The message was from an unknown number, but the words made her heart stop. The key you found in the garden. There's one more lock it opens. When you're ready, the whole truth awaits. J. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean. In its wake, decades of secrets had been exposed to the light, relationships shattered and reformed, and a young girl had discovered that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from exposing the truth, but from facing it with an open heart. The message on Sarah's phone seemed to pulse with possibility. She sat in the mansion's garden, the stone planter beside her, watching the sun set behind Harrison Tower in the distance. After the board meeting, the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet, like the aftermath of an earthquake. When you're ready, the whole truth awaits. J. The words echoed in her mind as she ran her fingers along the planter's weathered surface. Could it really be possible? After all these years? I thought I'd find you here, Elena's voice came softly. She sat beside her daughter, looking more at peace than she had in years. You're wondering if the message is really from him, aren't you? Sarah nodded, showing her mother the phone. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she read the words. The key from the garden. I always wondered if there was more to it than the safe deposit box. But how? Sarah whispered. Everyone thought he was gone? Elena finished. Not gone. Forever. Just gone where they couldn't find him. Your father was always 3 steps ahead. She pulled out her own phone, showing Sarah a series of emails from an anonymous account, dating back years. He's been watching, waiting for the right moment. Thomas appeared on the garden path, carrying a laptop. Miss Sarah, you need to see this. The key you found, it's not just a key, look. He opened the laptop, showing a close-up photo of the key's surface. Under magnification, tiny numbers were visible, etched into the metal. Coordinates, Sarah breathed, recognizing the pattern. She quickly typed them into a mapping application. The location pinged in a surprising place, not Switzerland, but right here in the city, in an old industrial district by the river. Victoria's voice startled them. She stood at the garden's edge, looking smaller somehow, without her usual armor of perfection. "I know that address," she said quietly. "It's where my father used to work before everything." Maxwell emerged from his study, his tie loosened, looking both exhausted and energized. "Sullivan just called. The FBI task force. They found something in the Project Phoenix files, references to a backup server, hidden somewhere in the city. All the original data, everything James discovered." "It's there," Victoria interrupted, pointing to the map on Thomas's laptop. "In my father's old office building. The organization, they used it as a dead drop location. James must have found out somehow." Sarah stood, determination filling her. "We have to go. Now." "It could be dangerous," Maxwell protested. "Those men, even with the arrests, aren't in a position to stop us anymore," came a new voice. Robert Sullivan walked into the garden, his usual professional demeanor marked by excitement. "The task force just arrested the last of their leaders. They're done." Elena touched the locket around her neck, the twin to the one Sarah wore. "James always said the truth has a way of surfacing, like a river breaking through a dam. You just have to know where to place the first crack." The old industrial building loomed before them as their small convoy arrived at sunset. Sarah clutched the key, feeling its weight. Not just metal, but years of secrets, of plans laid carefully by a father she barely knew, but who had never stopped protecting her. The building's security system was long dead, its corridors dark and dusty. Victoria led them through memories of her childhood, of visiting her father at work, before power and fear had changed everything. "His office was on the top floor," she said, her voice echoing in the empty space. They found the door, unmarked, unremarkable, but when Sarah held up the key, the numbers aligned perfectly with a faded serial number on the lock. Inside the office was a time capsule, dust-covered furniture, old filing cabinets, and in the corner a hidden panel that slid open at Victoria's touch. "Dad's secret storage," she whispered. "He used to hide birthday presents here." The panel revealed not presents but a state-of-the-art server, humming quietly, powered by a sophisticated backup system. And taped to its surface, an envelope addressed to "My daughter when the time is right." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, reading words written 12 years ago. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then everything has fallen into place. The truth about Project Phoenix is now in your hands, but there's one more truth you need to know. Look behind you." They all turned at the sound of footsteps in the doorway. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun streaming through the windows. A man whose features Sarah knew from photographs, whose eyes she saw every morning in the mirror. "Hello, Sarah," James Morrison said softly. "I think it's time we talked." Time seemed to stop in that dusty office as Sarah stared at the father she'd never known. James Morrison looked older than in his photographs, his hair touched with grey, but his eyes, her eyes, were exactly as she'd imagined. Eleanor made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "You're really here," Sarah whispered, taking a tentative step forward. "All this time?" James moved into the room, his movements careful, as if afraid any sudden motion might shatter the moment. "I never stopped watching over you, never stopped protecting you both. But I had to. Wait until they couldn't hurt us anymore." Victoria pressed herself against the wall, her face pale with shock. "You knew," she said, "about my father, about everything. That's why you left the evidence here in his office." James nodded, his expression softening as he looked at his former friend's wife. "Your father was a good man, Victoria. He tried to expose them too, just like I did. But he didn't have the resources, the connections to disappear like I could." Maxwell stood frozen, staring at his former best friend. 12 years of guilt, of choices made and paths not taken, hung between them. "James, I should have listened, should have believed you when—" "The past is past, Max," James interrupted gently. "You made the choices you thought would protect everyone, just like I did." Sarah found her voice again. "But how? How did you manage to stay hidden all these years?" James moved to the server, his fingers trailing over its surface with familiar ease. "I had help. International contacts from my environmental work. People who'd seen firsthand what companies like Project Phoenix could do to communities. They helped me create a new identity, set up monitoring systems." He smiled slightly. "Did you think those anonymous donations for Elena's medical care came from nowhere?" Elena stepped forward, tears streaming freely down her face. "You were there all along, the flowers at the hospital, the mysterious payments." "I couldn't let you face it alone," James said softly. "But I had to stay away until we had everything. All the evidence, all the connections. One wrong move, and they would have... They would have what?" Sarah pressed. Victoria answered, her voice hollow with understanding. "They would have done what they did to my father. Made him disappear permanently." James turned to the server, typing rapidly on a keyboard hidden in the wall. Screens flickered to life, revealing years of accumulated data. This server contains everything, not just about Project Phoenix, but about their entire operation. Every illegal dump site, every bribe, every shell company. He looked at Victoria. Everything about what happened to Richard Foster. Victoria's legs gave out and Sullivan quickly helped her to a dusty chair. "My father, you found him." "He's alive," James said quietly. "Hidden away in a small town in Oregon, under a new identity. They made him disappear, but they didn't have the stomach for anything worse. He's been waiting, Victoria. Waiting for the day it would be safe to contact you." Sarah watched as Victoria covered her face with her hands, years of carefully constructed walls crumbling. Maxwell moved to comfort his wife, but stopped, uncertain, caught between past and present loyalties. "The task force will need all of this," Sullivan said, gesturing to the server. "It's the final nail in their coffin." "They'll have it," James assured him. "But first," he turned to Sarah, pulling a small box from his pocket. "This belongs to you. I've been carrying it for 12 years, waiting for this moment." Inside the box was a simple silver bracelet, engraved with words that made Sarah's heart skip. "To my daughter, whose courage will light the way." "I had it made the day you were born," James explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew, somehow, that you would be the one to bring everything into the light, that you would have the strength to face the truth, no matter how difficult." As the sun set over the city, its last rays filtering through dusty windows, a family torn apart by secrets began to heal. Helena and James, separated by years but never by love. Victoria, freed from the prison of her past. Maxwell, finding redemption in truth rather than power. And Sarah, standing in the middle of it all, wearing her father's bracelet, holding her mother's locket, finally understanding that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived, with an open heart and the courage to face whatever truths they reveal. Morning light streamed through the Harrison Mansion's windows, casting everything in a gentle glow that made the past week's events feel almost dreamlike. Sarah sat in the garden, her father's bracelet catching the sun as she turned pages in her mother's journal. But now the words held different meanings, layers she hadn't understood before. "The garden's changed," James said softly, joining her on the bench. He'd been staying in the guest house, his presence both strange and natural, like a familiar song played in a new key. "But these roses, they're the same ones." "Thomas kept them alive," Sarah replied, touching a velvet petal. "He said they were too important to let go." Inside the mansion, Eleanor was meeting with Michael Chen, finalizing her testimony for the federal investigation. Her health had improved dramatically since James's return, as if his presence had lifted a weight she'd carried for too long. Victoria appeared at the garden's edge, hesitant in a way that still surprised Sarah. Gone were the designer suits and perfect makeup, replaced by simple clothes and an uncertain smile. "James, there's a call. It's my father." The change in Victoria over the past days had been remarkable. Each conversation with Richard Foster seemed to chip away at her carefully constructed facade, revealing the young woman who had once simply wanted her father's approval. "Go," Sarah encouraged. Seeing her father's hesitation, "I'm not going anywhere." As James followed Victoria inside, Sarah returned to the journal, finding an entry from just after she was born. "Looking at our daughter, I see all the possibilities of a future without fear. James believes that truth, like water, always finds its way to the surface. Today, holding Sarah, I finally understand what he means." Maxwell emerged from his study, where he'd spent days working with the FBI task force. The investigation was expanding, revealing connections to similar environmental crimes across the country. But today, something else occupied his thoughts. "Sarah," he called softly, approaching the bench. "Could we talk?" She nodded, making room for him. Maxwell sat, looking older and somehow more human than she'd ever seen him. "I've been thinking about choices," he began, "about the day James came to me with his concerns about Project Phoenix. I chose wrong, not just about the company, but about you." "You were trying to protect everyone," Sarah said, surprising herself with the understanding in her voice. "Perhaps, but protection without truth isn't really protection at all." He pulled out an old photograph, himself and James at their college graduation. "Your father was always the brave one. He saw what was right and didn't hesitate. I saw what was easy and called it necessary." Thomas appeared with a tray of lemonade, the same recipe Eleanor had loved years ago. As he poured glasses, his weathered face broke into a smile. "Miss Elena's in the kitchen, teaching the new cook her special cookies, just like old times." The mansion was coming alive again, but differently now. Where there had once been secrets and silence, there was conversation and laughter. The staff moved more freely, no longer walking on eggshells around Victoria's perfectionism. Margaret emerged from the house, carrying a stack of papers. "Miss Sarah, these were in storage. Your mother's original manuscript, the one she was working on before everything changed." Sarah accepted the papers reverently. The title page read, "Truth Blooms Eternal," the same words James had encoded in the garden roses. Below it, a dedication, "To my daughter who will understand when the time is right." Inside the mansion, they could hear Victoria's voice, thick with emotion as she spoke to her father. James's deeper tones provided quiet support. Eleanor's laugh drifted from the kitchen, accompanied by the smell of baking cookies. "It's strange," Sarah said, looking at Maxwell. "A week ago I thought finding my father would answer all my questions. But it's not about answers, is it? It's about understanding." Maxwell nodded slowly. "Understanding and forgiveness of others and ourselves." He stood, straightening his shoulders. "The board meeting this afternoon, we're announcing major changes. Environmental cleanup funds, community restoration projects. Everything James wanted to do 12 years ago. Better late than never," James said, rejoining them in the garden. His eyes were warm as he looked at his old friend. "The truth doesn't just set us free, Max. It gives us a chance to start again." Sarah opened her mother's manuscript, reading the first lines. "Some stories aren't about what was lost, but about what remains when all the lies fall away. Some families aren't built on blood alone, but on the courage to face truth together." The garden roses bloomed around them, their fragrance a reminder of secrets revealed and bridges rebuilt. In the distance, Harrison Tower stood against the sky, no longer a symbol of power and secrets, but of transformation and hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Harrison Industries boardroom as Maxwell stood before the assembled press. Sarah watched from the back of the room, flanked by her parents, as he announced the company's new direction. "Project Phoenix was born from darkness," Maxwell began, his voice steady. "But from its ashes, we're building something new. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund will dedicate billions to cleaning up the damage we caused and preventing future harm." Camera flashes punctuated his words as reporters scribbled furiously. In the front row, Michael Chen sat beside his mother, both nodding in approval. The restaurant where Sarah had stayed now held regular family dinners, bridging old worlds and new. Victoria sat quietly beside her husband, transformed by recent events. That morning she'd spoken to her father for hours, planning their reunion. Richard Foster would return next week, no longer hiding from the shadows that had driven him away. Furthermore, Maxwell continued, I'm pleased to announce our new Chief Environmental Officer. He gestured to James, who stepped forward. James, Morrison's vision 12 years ago was right. Today we're finally listening. Sarah felt her mother squeeze her hand as James took the podium. The past week had been a whirlwind of adjustments, family dinners in the mansion's formal dining room, late-night conversations in the garden, learning the rhythm of having two parents after years with one. Environmental justice isn't just about regulations and reports, James began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. It's about communities, about leaving a better world for our children. His eyes found Sarah in the crowd, full of pride and love. After the press conference, they gathered in Maxwell's study, not as adversaries or conspirators, but as something closer to family. Victoria's phone buzzed with updates from the task force. The investigation was expanding, but now she was helping, using her knowledge to unravel the organization's remaining threads. Your father would be proud, James told her softly. He never stopped believing you'd find your way back to the truth. Victoria touched the simple locket she now wore, a gift from Richard, sent from his years in hiding. I spent so long being afraid of becoming nothing, she said. I almost lost everything that made me someone. Eleanor, looking healthier and happier than she had in years, sat at Maxwell's desk, finalizing her book. The manuscript that had waited 12 years would finally tell its story. Some truths need time to ripen, she read from the preface. Like roses in a garden, they bloom when ready, not when demanded. Sarah moved to the window, watching the sunset paint Harrison Tower in shades of gold. Her reflection showed a different person than the girl who had arrived at the mansion's gates, stronger, wiser, but also more compassionate. Thomas knocked gently, entering with Margaret. The garden party preparations are ready, he announced. The mansion would host a different kind of gathering tonight, not a charity gala for show, but a celebration of truth and reconciliation. I've been thinking, Maxwell said, turning from his desk. The mansion's too big for just Victoria and me, and with James taking the environmental position. Are you suggesting what I think you are? Elena asked, surprised. Maxwell nodded. This house has held enough secrets. It's time it held a family instead. Sarah looked between her parents, hope blooming in her chest. The idea of living in the mansion had once seemed impossible, a fairy tale. Now it felt like coming full circle. We'd have to repaint my room, she said thoughtfully. The pink is a bit much. Laughter filled the study. Real laughter, not the polite social kind that had once echoed through these halls. Victoria wiped away tears, smiling. I think I know a good decorator, someone who understands the importance of fresh starts. As evening approached, guests began arriving for the garden party. Not the usual society crowds, but a mix of people connected by the story's threads. Mrs. Chen and her family, Sullivan and his wife, board members and their families, even some of the environmental activists who had helped James over the years. The garden roses bloomed under twinkling lights, their fragrance mixing with music and conversation. Sarah sat with her parents on their old bench, watching Victoria greet guests with genuine warmth instead of practiced charm. You know, James said, touching the bracelet on Sarah's wrist, when I had this made, I imagined a moment like this. Not the details, but the feeling of truth finally set free, of family found and restored. Elena leaned against him, their years apart dissolving in the garden's magic. Sarah was right. It was never about finding all the answers. It was about having the courage to keep asking questions. Sarah opened her mother's journal one last time, finding a blank page at the end. Taking out a pen, she began to write. The truth about family isn't in DNA tests or legal documents. It's in the choices we make, the forgiveness we offer, and the love that remains when all the masks fall away. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, witnesses to endings and beginnings, to secrets revealed and hearts renewed. The Harrison mansion, once a fortress of lies, had become a sanctuary of truth, its gardens blooming with possibilities as vast as the night sky itself. A week had passed since the garden party, and the Harrison mansion buzzed with activity. Moving boxes lined the halls as Eleanor and Sarah's belongings found their way into their new home. James supervised the renovation of the East Wing, transforming it into a comfortable family space while maintaining the house's historic charm. The construction crew found something interesting behind the old wallpaper, Thomas announced, entering. The library where Sarah was helping Elena organize her books. He held out a faded envelope, its edges yellow with age. It's addressed to the future residents of Harrison House. Sarah carefully opened the envelope, revealing a letter written in elegant script. It's from Maxwell's grandmother, she breathed, reading the date, 1952. Elena and James gathered around as Sarah read aloud. To those who find this letter, know that this house was built not just with bricks and mortar, but with dreams of bringing people together. May its walls protect not secrets, but love. May its gardens grow not just flowers, but hope. She was quite the visionary. Victoria's voice came from the doorway. She looked relaxed in casual clothes, a sight that still surprised Sarah. I found her diaries in the attic yesterday. She believed houses had souls, that they absorbed the energy of the people who lived in them. Then this house must be feeling quite different lately, James observed, smiling. Victoria nodded, stepping into the library. Richard, Dad, he's arriving tomorrow. After 12 years, her voice caught. I barely remember how to be someone's daughter. You'll learn together, Eleanor said softly, just like we're all learning. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway drew their attention. Through the library windows, they watched Maxwell return from Harrison Industries, where the transformation continued. The company's new environmental initiatives had garnered international attention, with other corporations beginning to follow their lead. The board approved the final settlement package, Maxwell announced as he joined them. Full compensation for all affected communities, plus funding for long-term health monitoring and environmental restoration. James nodded approvingly. The technical teams are already on the ground at the worst sites. It won't be quick, but we'll make it right. Sarah watched the adults talk, marveling at how natural it felt now. Her father's environmental passion, Maxwell's determination to correct past wrongs, Victoria's quiet support. Even the house felt different, as if Maxwell's grandmother had been right about its soul. I found something else too, Victoria said, pulling out an old photo album. From the company's early days. She opened it to reveal pictures of a much younger Maxwell and James, working late in their first office. You were both so idealistic then. We still are, James replied, just wiser about how to make change happen. Elena touched a photo of herself from that time, young and hopeful at her desk outside James's office. Everything felt possible then, and somehow it feels possible again. Sarah opened her mother's journal, now filled with new entries about hope and healing instead of secrets and fear. On a fresh page, she began to write, "The mansion's soul is changing, Grandmother Harrison. Your dreams of bringing people together, they're finally coming true." The library had become their favorite gathering place, its walls lined with both old memories and new possibilities. Thomas entered with a tea tray, followed by Margaret carrying a fresh batch of Elena's cookies. The formal service had given way to comfortable familiarity. "The gardeners want to know about the new rose garden," Thomas mentioned. "The plans you drew up, Miss Sarah." "I thought we could plant different colors," Sarah explained, pulling out her sketch, "each representing something we want to grow. In this new chapter, white for truth, pink for healing, red for love, and yellow," James added softly, "for hope." Victoria touched the roses in the sketch. "Richard, Dad, he used to grow roses too before everything happened. Maybe," she hesitated, "maybe he'd like to help with this garden." Maxwell wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. "I think that's a wonderful idea. This house has room for all our stories now." Through the library windows, the setting sun painted the garden in warm hues. The old rose bushes that had guarded so many secrets now stood ready to welcome new growth beside them. Sarah watched a family of birds settle into the garden for the evening, building their nest just as this unlikely family was building their new life together. "You know what else Grandmother Harrison wrote?" Sarah said, returning to the letter. "She said that the true measure of a home isn't in its size or grandeur, but in its capacity to heal broken hearts and bridge divided lives. Elena smiled, leaning against James. She would be proud of what this house has become, of what we've all become. As evening settled over the mansion, its windows glowed with warm light, no longer hiding shadows, but illuminating new beginnings. In the garden, the roses turned their faces to the last rays of sun, promising tomorrow's blooms. And in the library, surrounded by books and memories both old and new, a family continued to learn the gentle art of growing together. The morning of Richard Foster's return dawned clear and bright. Victoria stood before her mirror, adjusting and readjusting her simple blouse, all her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. Sarah watched from the doorway, remembering her own nervous anticipation just weeks ago. "You look perfect," she assured her former adversary, now something closer to family. "Just be yourself." Victoria laughed softly. "I'm not sure I remember who that is. I've been Victoria Harrison for so long." "Then maybe it's time to be both," Elena suggested, joining them. "Victoria Harrison Foster, the strength you've built and the truth you've reclaimed." The sound of tires on gravel sent Victoria rushing to the window. A simple sedan approached, nothing like the luxury cars that once dominated the mansion's driveway. Behind the wheel sat a man with Victoria's eyes and gentle smile, Richard Foster, no longer hiding in small-town Oregon. James and Maxwell stood ready to welcome him, their own complicated history lending understanding to this moment of reunion. As Victoria stepped onto the front portico, time seemed to suspend. Richard emerged from the car slowly, age and emotion making his movements careful. "Claire," he whispered, using the name Victoria hadn't heard in decades. "My little girl." Victoria, Claire, ran down the steps like a much younger woman, falling into her father's arms. "Daddy," she sobbed, years of practiced perfection crumbling in the face of pure love. Sarah felt her own father's hand on her shoulder, strong and reassuring. The parallel wasn't lost on any of them. Two fathers returned, two daughters healing, two families rebuilding. Later, in the garden, Richard walked among the roses, touching their petals with familiar tenderness. "Your grandmother taught me about roses," he told Victoria, who hadn't left his side, "about how they need both sunshine and rain to grow strong." "Just like people," Sarah added, thinking of her mother's journal entries about truth blooming in unexpected places. The day unfolded like a flower opening to the sun. Richard shared stories of his years in hiding, of watching his daughter from afar through news clippings and social media. Victoria spoke of her transformation, of learning to replace fear with courage, perfection with authenticity. In the kitchen, Eleanor and Margaret prepared a family dinner, not the formal affairs of the past, but a warm gathering of hearts finding their way home. Thomas supervised the table setting in the informal dining room, where photographs of both families now lined the walls. "I have something for you," Richard said to Victoria as evening approached. He retrieved a worn box from his car. "I kept it all these years, hoping—" Inside lay a pressed rose, perfectly preserved. "From your first garden," he explained. "The day you told me you wanted to change the world." Victoria touched the dried petals gently. "I lost my way for a while, but Sarah," she smiled at the girl who had started it all, "she helped me find it again." Maxwell raised his glass at dinner, looking around the table at faces that reflected both past and present. "To new beginnings," he said simply, "and to the truth that sets us free. And to gardens," Sarah added, "that bloom even after the longest winters." As night fell, they gathered in the library, now a true family room, its formal furniture replaced with comfortable pieces that invited conversation and connection. Eleanor worked on her book, James and Maxwell discussed environmental projects, and Victoria sat close to her father, making up for lost time. Sarah found herself by the window, watching the garden where so many secrets had been buried and so many truths had bloomed. In her journal she wrote, "Sometimes family isn't about where you start, but where you choose to grow. Sometimes home isn't a place that claims you, but a place you claim through love and truth." Thomas appeared with a familiar tray, Elena's. Cookies and warm milk, a childhood comfort that now served a deeper purpose. "Miss Sarah," he said softly, "your grandmother Harrison would be proud." The house has found its soul again. Through the window, the roses swayed in the evening breeze, their petals catching the last light. White for truth, pink for healing, red for love, and yellow for hope, all growing together in tomorrow's garden, promised but not yet planted. Just like the family gathered in the warm library light, Richard's voice carried across the room as he told Victoria stories of her childhood, filling in the gaps that fear had created. James and Elena sat close together, their years apart, bridged by love that had never truly faded. Maxwell watched. It all with quiet satisfaction, his empire transformed into something far more valuable. A home where truth and love grew in equal measure. And Sarah, surrounded by the family she had helped create, understood finally what her mother had written. So long ago, the heart like a garden can always bloom again. It just needs the courage to break new ground, the patience to nurture new growth, and the faith to believe in tomorrow's flowers. 1 month after Richard's return, the Harrison mansion prepared for another transformation. The new rose garden was ready for planting, its design a collaboration between Sarah, Richard, and Thomas. The morning air hummed with anticipation as families gathered in the garden. "Each rose represents a promise," Sarah explained to the assembled group, her voice carrying across the garden where chairs had been arranged for the occasion. "A promise to nurture truth, to cultivate understanding, and to let love grow freely." Eleanor stood beside James, both beaming with pride as their daughter led the planting ceremony. Victoria and Richard worked together, their hands joining in the soil as they planted the first rosebush, a unique variety Richard had cultivated during his years in hiding, which he'd named Claire's Hope. "I always dreamed of sharing my love of roses with you," Richard told Victoria softly, their hands dirty from the rich earth. "Even in Oregon, I kept a small garden. It helped me feel connected to you." Maxwell, who had once measured success in stock prices and corporate acquisitions, now watched with quiet satisfaction as his wife and father-in-law strengthened their bond through simple acts of gardening. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund was transforming communities, but this transformation of hearts and relationships felt even more significant. "The board meeting went well?" James asked, joining his old friend. Maxwell nodded. "Better than expected. The international initiative you proposed, using our environmental cleanup expertise to help other companies transition to sustainable practices, it's gaining traction. 5 major corporations have already signed on." Sarah moved among the rose bushes, reading the small plaques that would mark each variety. "White Truth, Healing Heart, Love's Return, and Tomorrow's Promise," each name chosen carefully to reflect their journey. Mrs. Chen and her family had joined the planting ceremony, bringing traditional Chinese tea to share. The restaurateur, who had once sheltered Sarah, now sat with Elena, exchanging recipes and stories. Her son Michael, still handling the legal aspects of Harrison Industries' transformation, discussed environmental law with James. Thomas supervised the planting, with professional pride, though his role had evolved far beyond that of a simple groundskeeper. He had become the keeper of stories, the witness to transformations, the steady presence that helped bridge past and present. "Miss Sarah," he called, holding up an old brass key. "I found this while preparing the garden bed. I believe it belongs to the original greenhouse, the one your grandmother Harrison used." The greenhouse, long abandoned, stood at the far end of the garden. Sarah took the key, feeling its weight, another piece of history waiting to be rediscovered and renewed. "We could restore it," Victoria suggested, joining them. "Make it a place for new beginnings, just like the rose garden." Eleanor opened her journal, now nearly full with entries about healing and hope rather than secrets and fear. "Your grandmother wrote about that greenhouse," she told Sarah. "She called it her sanctuary of second chances, where damaged plants could heal and bloom again." Richard stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "I might know something about that. In Oregon, I specialized in rehabilitating struggling plants. Perhaps," he glanced at Victoria, "we could work on it together." The planting continued through the morning, each rose finding its place in the carefully prepared soil. Margaret organized refreshments under the shade of old oak trees, where photographs of both families, past and present, were displayed on simple wooden easels. Sarah found herself drawn to these images, her father and Maxwell in their college days, Elena in her early days at the mansion, Victoria as a young girl in Richard's garden, and newer photos showing their blended family coming together. "It's remarkable," Sullivan commented, having stopped by with his wife to participate in the planting. "A month ago I was investigating James's disappearance. Now look at all this." James smiled, his arm around Elena. "Sometimes the best investigations lead us not to what was lost, but to what can be found." As the day progressed, Sarah sat with her journal, recording the moment. "Today we planted more than roses. We planted hope in soil enriched by truth, watered with tears of joy rather than sorrow. Each flower will bloom as a reminder that love, like nature, knows no boundaries of time or circumstance." The greenhouse key lay beside her, promising new adventures and discoveries. Through its dusty windows, she could see the potential for another transformation, another chance to blend past and present into something beautiful. Victoria joined her, changed yet familiar. "You know," she said, touching the key gently, "when you first came to our door, I thought you would destroy everything I'd built. I never imagined you would help me rebuild something far better. Once you've..." Them clouds parted to reveal perfect blue sky, as if nature herself approved of their gathering. The roses, though newly planted, seemed to stand taller in the afternoon light, reaching toward tomorrow's promise with quiet confidence. The greenhouse restoration became a family project that filled the warm summer days. Sarah, James, and Richard worked side by side, carefully replacing broken glass panes while preserving the original Victorian structure. Victoria discovered a talent for organizing the space, creating areas for different types of plants and healing spaces. "Look what I found," Sarah called one afternoon, carefully lifting a metal box from beneath decades of debris. Inside, they discovered Grandmother Harrison's gardening journals, filled with wisdom that bridged generations. "A greenhouse," Sarah, read aloud, "is like a family. It needs strong foundations, clear boundaries, and endless patience. But most importantly, it needs love, the kind that lets each plant grow in its own way, at its own pace." Eleanor, taking a break from finalizing her book manuscript, smiled at the words. Her own story of truth and reconciliation had found its audience, becoming a beacon of hope for others facing similar struggles. The advance reviews praised its honest exploration of family, forgiveness, and the courage to face difficult truths. Maxwell had transformed too, finding purpose beyond corporate success. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund was making real change, and his partnership with James had become a model for corporate responsibility. Together, they were proving that business success and environmental stewardship could flourish side by side. "The first seedlings are ready," Richard announced one morning, showing Victoria the tender plants they'd nurture in the restored greenhouse. Father and daughter had developed their own language of growth and care, healing their relationship through shared purpose. Sarah watched them work, remembering the day she'd first arrived at the mansion's gates. How far they'd all come from secrets and suspicion to this place of open hearts and shared dreams. "Your mother would be proud," Thomas said, joining her at the greenhouse door. "Both of them would be." Sarah touched her father's bracelet, now accompanied by her mother's locket. "They're here to be proud themselves," she smiled, watching James and Elena approach with lunch for the greenhouse crew. The mansion had transformed alongside its inhabitants. Where there had once been formal rooms kept perfect for show, there were now lived-in spaces, filled with family photos and children's books for Sarah's cousins when they visited. The library had become a true family room, holding not just books, but board games, art supplies, and Eleanor's manuscript drafts. Victoria had found her own way to blend past and present, displaying photographs of both her lives, Claire Foster's childhood and Victoria Harrison's journey, side by side. Richard's presence had helped her understand that strength could come from embracing all parts of oneself. "I've been thinking," Maxwell said during one family dinner, "about Grandmother Harrison's letter, about houses having souls. This place feels more alive now than it ever has." "Because it's finally what it was meant to be," Elena replied. A home for truth, for healing, for love in all its forms. The greenhouse project neared completion as summer began to fade. Sarah stood inside, watching sunlight stream through the restored glass panels, creating rainbows on the wooden floors. Each plant had its place, each broken thing had been mended, each empty space filled with new life. "Ready for the final touch?" James asked, holding out a small copper plaque they'd had made. Together, they mounted it beside the door. "The Harrison Foster Sanctuary where hope blooms eternal." That evening, the family gathered in the new rose garden. The first blooms had opened, their colors brilliant against the twilight sky. White for truth, pink for healing, red for love, and yellow for hope. Each flower a testament to their journey. Sarah opened her journal one last time, finding a blank page near the end. Sometimes the greatest adventures aren't about discovering new places, but about finding your way home. Sometimes the most important truth isn't in what we uncover, but in what we choose to nurture and grow. Elena leaned against James, their years apart dissolved in the joy of togetherness. Victoria and Richard worked among the roses, their conversation flowing easily now. Maxwell watched it all with contentment, understanding finally that true wealth lay not in what you possessed, but in what you helped to grow. Thomas and Margaret served evening tea in the garden. Their roles evolved from staff to family. Mrs. Chen had brought her special almond cookies, a reminder of the kindness that had helped truth find its way home. As stars began to appear above the greenhouse's peaked roof, Sarah looked around at her expanded family. Not just parents found and restored, but hearts healed and connections strengthened. The mansion stood behind them, its windows glowing. With warm light, no longer hiding shadows but illuminating new beginnings. "You know what else Grandmother Harrison wrote?" Sarah said, holding up the gardening journal. "The greatest gardens are never finished. They grow and change, surprise and delight, teaching us that love, like nature, is always ready for new seasons of wonder." Around them, the roses nodded in the evening breeze, their petals catching the last light like promises waiting to bloom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new possibilities. But here, in this garden of truth and reconciliation, they had planted something eternal, the understanding that family, like flowers, grows best in soil enriched by love and watered with faith in tomorrow's blooms. Autumn painted the Harrison estate in brilliant shades of gold and crimson as the family gathered for Elena's book launch. The greenhouse, now fully restored, hosted the intimate celebration, its glass panels reflecting the seasons' changing colors. Roses from their special garden decorated every surface, their fragrance mixing with the earthy scent of falling leaves. "Truth blooms eternal isn't just my story," Elena addressed the small crowd of family and close friends. "It's a testament to the power of love to overcome fear, of truth to heal old wounds, and of family to grow in unexpected ways." Sarah sat between her parents, feeling the weight of the moment. Just months ago, she'd stood at the mansion's gates, clutching a locket and hoping for answers. Now she was surrounded by a family that had grown beyond blood ties to encompass all the hearts touched by their journey. Victoria and Richard had transformed the greenhouse's upper level into a reading room, with comfortable chairs and shelves, lined with both gardening books and family photographs. Maxwell often found them there, father and daughter discussing everything from rose cultivation to life's deeper truths. "The advanced sales are remarkable," Michael Chen reported, holding up the latest figures. "Your story is resonating with people around the world. The themes of environmental justice and family reconciliation seem to have struck a powerful chord." James squeezed Elena's hand as she signed copies for their guests. His environmental initiatives at Harrison Industries had become a model for corporate reform, proving that profit and principle could coexist. The company's transformation had inspired others, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the business world. "Sarah," Thomas called softly, beckoning her to a quiet corner of the greenhouse. "There's something your grandmother Harrison left specifically for this day." He handed her an envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Inside, Sarah found a letter dated decades ago. "To be opened when truth and love have fully bloomed in these halls again." The handwriting matched the journal entries they discovered during the greenhouse restoration. "My dearest future family," Sarah read aloud, her parents gathering close. "If you're reading this, then the mansion has fulfilled its true purpose. Not as a monument to wealth or power, but as a sanctuary for healing hearts. The greenhouse was always my favorite place, where broken things could be mended and new life could take root. May you continue to grow here, in truth and in love, letting each season bring new wonders." Victoria joined them, Richard at her side. "She knew," Victoria said softly. "Somehow she knew this day would come." Maxwell stood in the greenhouse doorway, watching his transformed family with quiet joy. The corporate empire he'd once prized above all else had become something far more valuable. A force for positive change in the world, guided by conscience rather than greed. Mrs. Chen moved through the gathering, offering her special almond cookies, the same ones that had comforted Sarah during her first days of searching for truth. Her restaurant had become a regular family gathering place, bridging the worlds of past and present. "You know what's remarkable?" Eleanor said, joining Sarah by the roses they'd planted together. "Every ending becomes a beginning if we're brave enough to let it." Sarah opened her journal, its pages now filled with not just questions and discoveries, but wisdom gained through love's patient teaching. "The truth about family," she wrote, "isn't in the stories we inherit, but in the ones we choose to write, together." The afternoon light filtered through the greenhouse glass, creating patterns like stained glass on the gathered faces. Each person present had played a role in their journey, from Thomas and Margaret's steady support to Sullivan's honest investigation, from Mrs. Chen's kindness to Michael's legal expertise. James stood to make a toast, his voice carrying emotion accumulated through years of separation and reunion. To the power of truth to set us free, to love's ability to heal all wounds, and to this remarkable family that proves it's never too late for new beginnings. As evening approached, the greenhouse lights twinkled like stars caught in glass. Elena's book, displayed on a special stand, bore a dedication that brought tears to many eyes. "To my daughter Sarah, who taught us all that the greatest truth is love's capacity to bloom even in life's harshest seasons." Sarah looked around at her expanded family, her parents restored to each other, Victoria and Richard healing their past, Maxwell finding his true legacy, and all the others who had become part of their story. The greenhouse, like their hearts, had been transformed from a place of broken things to a sanctuary of new growth and endless possibilities. Outside, the autumn wind carried the scent of their special roses, white for truth, pink for healing, red for love, and yellow for hope. Each bloom stood as testament to their journey, each petal a promise that love, like nature, knows no bounds when given room to grow. As winter approached, the Harrison mansion prepared for its first holiday season as a true family home. The greenhouse bloomed defiantly against the cold, its restored glass panels sheltering not just plants, but the dreams and hopes of 3 generations. Inside the warm space, Sarah sat with her grandmother Harrison's journals spread before her, adding her own entries to the family legacy. "The thing about truth," she wrote, "is that it doesn't just set us free. It gives us roots to grow and wings to soar. Our family's story didn't end when the secrets came to light. That's when it truly began. The mansion had become a gathering place for more than just their immediate family. Environmental activists seeking guidance from James, corporate leaders, learning from Maxwell's transformation, and families inspired by Elena's book all found their way to the restored greenhouse and its message of hope and renewal. Victoria and Richard had established a foundation focusing on family reconciliation, inspired by their own journey back to each other. The programs they developed helped other families heal from secrets and separation, proving that it's never too late for truth to bloom. "I never imagined this," Victoria confessed one evening, watching snow fall softly outside the greenhouse windows. "When Sarah first came to our door, I thought she would destroy everything. Instead, she helped us build something far more precious." Eleanor's book had sparked a movement, encouraging others to face their own buried truths. Letters poured in from around the world, sharing stories of family secrets revealed and relationships restored. Each one found its way to the greenhouse's reading room, testament to the universal power of love and truth. "Your grandmother was right," James told Sarah as they tended the winter roses together. "A home isn't about walls and windows, it's about the hearts that find shelter within them." Maxwell had discovered a new purpose beyond corporate success. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund had expanded globally, with James leading initiatives that proved business could thrive while healing the earth. Together, they were writing a new chapter in corporate responsibility. Thomas and Margaret, no longer bound by formal roles, had become family historians, keeping alive the stories that had shaped their journey. Their knowledge helped bridge past and present, ensuring that lessons learned would guide future generations. Mrs. Chen's restaurant had become a second family gathering place, its walls now adorned with photos of their expanded family. Her almond cookies, once a comfort to a searching child, remained a symbol of the kindness that had helped truth find its way home. Sarah stood in the greenhouse's center, surrounded by blooming life despite the winter chill outside. The special roses they'd planted continued to thrive, white for truth, pink for healing, red for love, and yellow for hope. Each flower seemed to whisper their story to visitors who came seeking inspiration. "You see," she explained to a group of students visiting the greenhouse, "sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. Like a seed pushing through soil, truth finds its way to light if we give it chance to grow." Elena and James, watching their daughter share their family's story, held each other close. The years of separation had taught them that love, like the hardiest rose, can survive life's harshest seasons if its roots run deep enough. Victoria and Richard worked together in their special corner of the greenhouse, where they cultivated rare roses, including their signature bloom, Claire's Hope. Their relationship had blossomed like the flowers they tended, proving that with patience and care, even the most damaged relationships could flourish again. As evening fell, the family gathered in the greenhouse's reading room for their nightly tradition. Elena read from her book, her words carrying new meaning with each passing day. In the end, the truth about family isn't written in DNA or legal documents. It's written in the choices we make, the love we share, and the hope we nurture together. Sarah added a final entry to her journal. "Our story isn't just about uncovering secrets or finding lost family. It's about the courage to let love grow in new directions, to let truth transform us, and to believe that every ending can become a beautiful beginning." The greenhouse lights twinkled against the winter dark, a beacon of warmth and hope. Inside, 3 generations of healing and growth continued their journey together, proving that love, like the most persistent flower, can bloom in any season when nurtured by truth and tended with care. And so, the Harrison Mansion, once a fortress of secrets, became a sanctuary of hope. Its gardens, greenhouse, and halls echoed with laughter, love, and the endless possibility of new beginnings. For in the end, the greatest truth they discovered was this: family, like a well-tended garden, grows most beautiful when every heart is free to bloom in its own way, in its own time, in soil enriched by love and truth eternal. Spring arrived at the Harrison estate with an unexpected discovery. During the annual garden preparation, Thomas uncovered an old metal box while tending to the rose beds. Its contents would spark a new chapter in their ever-evolving family story. "It's a collection of letters," Sarah explained, carefully laying out the weathered envelopes on the greenhouse's work table. "Between Grandmother Harrison and Victoria's father?" Richard Foster leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized his own father's handwriting. "I had no idea they knew each other," he whispered, while Victoria stood frozen beside him. The letters revealed a connection none of them had suspected. Richard's father, before his involvement with the organization that would later threaten his life, had been the Harrison estate's landscape architect. His friendship with Grandmother Harrison had been built on their shared love of gardens and truth. "My dearest friend," one letter read, "I fear the path I've chosen may lead to darkness. These men, their promises of wealth and power, they come at too high a price. Your gardens remind me of what's real, what matters. If anything happens, to me please watch over my Claire. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. She knew. All those years ago, she knew who I really was. Maxwell found himself remembering small moments. The way his grandmother had always shown special interest in Victoria when he first brought her home. How she'd insisted on teaching her about the gardens, despite Victoria's initial resistance. Eleanor, who had been working on her second book about family secrets and healing, saw a new story unfolding. She was keeping her promise to your father, she told Victoria softly, watching over you in her own way. James and Sarah worked together to arrange the letters chronologically, piecing together a narrative that spanned decades. The final letter, written just days before Grandmother Harrison's passing, was addressed to Victoria herself. "My dear Claire," Sarah read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion in the room. "If you're reading this, then truth has finally found its way home. Your father was one of the finest men I ever knew, a man who chose right over easy, truth over profit. The roses he planted still bloom in our gardens, hardy and strong, just like his daughter. Never doubt that you belong here, that this place is as much your heritage as it is Maxwell's." The greenhouse fell silent as the words settled around them. Victoria sat heavily in one of the reading room chairs, decades of belonging uncertainty, finally finding resolution. Richard held his daughter's hand, both of them connecting to a past they'd thought lost forever. "There's something else," Thomas said, reaching deeper into the box. He pulled out a carefully preserved rose pressed between glass plates. A small note identified it as Foster's Truth, a variety Richard's father had developed but never registered. "I remember this," Richard breathed. "Dad worked on it for years. He said it was special because it could bloom even in poor soil. Beauty refusing to be destroyed by harsh conditions." Sarah watched as Victoria and Richard examined the preserved flower, seeing another piece of their family history click into place. The greenhouse, which had already witnessed so much healing, seemed to glow with renewed purpose. Elena opened her journal, finding a fresh page. "Sometimes," she wrote, "the truth doesn't just set us free, it shows us we were never really lost at all. Like a garden waiting for spring, our connections remain alive beneath the surface, ready to bloom when conditions are right." Maxwell moved to the greenhouse doors, looking out over the gardens his grandmother had loved so dearly. The roses planted by Richard's father still bloomed there, their resilience a testament to truth's enduring power. In their shadows, new varieties grew, including the ones planted by their expanded family, each carrying its own story of survival and hope. Thomas carefully replanted some of the original Foster's Truth roses in a special section of the garden, their presence bridging past and present. Victoria worked beside him, finally understanding why she'd always felt drawn to this place, even in her darkest moments. "Your father's legacy lives in more than just these flowers," James told Victoria, watching her work. "It lives in your courage to face truth, to choose right over easy just as he did." As the spring day lengthened, the family gathered in the greenhouse's reading room, sharing stories and connecting dots that had waited decades to be joined. Sarah added the new letters to their growing collection of family documents, each piece adding depth to their shared history. The discovery of the letters sparked a new initiative at the Harrison estate. Victoria, inspired by her grandfather's legacy and her own journey to truth, proposed transforming part of the grounds into a healing garden, a space specifically designed for families working through their own reconciliation processes. "Her place where truth can take root," she explained during a family dinner, spreading out the preliminary designs, "where people can find the same healing we found here." The plans called for private meditation spaces, community gathering areas, and most importantly, a special greenhouse dedicated to growing Foster's Truth roses, which Richard had successfully propagated from the preserved specimen. Elena's publisher saw the potential immediately. "This could be the perfect launch point for your second book," she suggested during a video call. "A physical space that embodies the themes of healing and reconciliation you write about." Sarah, now spending her after-school hours learning both gardening and environmental science, had her own vision for the space. "What if we included a youth program?" she proposed, teaching kids about both environmental stewardship and emotional growth. James and Maxwell exchanged glances, seeing their own transformation reflected in these new possibilities. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund had already proven that healing could happen on multiple levels. Why not extend that to healing family relationships? We could partner with counseling services, Maxwell suggested, his business acumen now serving a deeper purpose. Create a comprehensive program that combines environmental education with family therapy. The project quickly took shape. Thomas and Richard worked together to map out the new gardens, their combined expertise creating spaces that seemed to naturally encourage openness and connection. Victoria, drawing on her own experience, helped design quiet corners where difficult conversations could unfold safely. Mrs. Chen, whose restaurant had been a sanctuary for Sarah during her own search for truth, offered to create a special menu for the garden's cafe. "Food brings people together," she said simply. "It opens hearts." Construction began as spring deepened into summer. The new garden took shape alongside the original one, each space designed to complement the other. Sarah often found herself working alongside her father, learning how environmental principles could apply to emotional healing. "See how these plants support each other," James explained one afternoon, showing her how different species work together in the ecosystem they were creating. That's what families can do when they're given the right conditions to grow. Elena, watching her daughter absorb these lessons, added another chapter to her new book. Healing isn't just about addressing past wounds, it's about creating spaces where new growth becomes possible. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply the room to bloom. Victoria spent hours in the new greenhouse working with the Foster's truth roses. Each successful propagation felt like a connection to her grandfather, a man who had chosen integrity over safety. Richard often joined her, sharing stories of his own father that helped Victoria understand her heritage of courage. Maxwell, who had once measured success in profit margins, found himself moved by the transformations happening in the garden. Families began visiting even before the official opening, drawn by word of mouth and the promise of healing. "It's extraordinary," Sullivan commented during a visit. The former investigator had become a friend and advocate for the family's various projects. "How something that started with one girl's search for truth has grown into this." Sarah smiled, touching her father's bracelet. "That's what truth does," she said. "It grows like a seed catching light. You just have to be brave enough to plant it." The healing garden's paths wound through carefully designed spaces, each turn offering new perspectives and possibilities. Benches placed in quiet corners held plaques with quotes about truth and reconciliation, including words from Elena's books and Grandmother Harrison's journals. As summer bloomed fully, the garden filled with life. Not just plants, but people finding their way back to each other. Families working through their own histories of secrets and separation found hope in the Harrison family's story and strength in the space they'd created. Thomas, watching it all from his favorite spot near the original roses, smiled. "Your grandmother would have loved this," he told Sarah. "She always said a garden should do more than please the eye. It should heal the heart." The Foster's Truth roses, now blooming throughout the new garden, seemed to glow with an inner light. Their unique resilience, born from Richard's father's vision, offered living proof that beauty could emerge from even the most challenging circumstances. The Healing Garden's official opening coincided with Elena's second book launch, drawing visitors from around the country. Families who had read about the Harrison Foster story came seeking their own paths to reconciliation, each bringing unique histories of separation and hope. "Every story matters," Elena told the gathered crowd during the opening ceremony. "Every journey toward truth deserves space to unfold." She stood between James and Sarah, their family's transformation a living testament to her words. Victoria had arranged for a special surprise. She'd tracked down other families affected by the same organization that had threatened her father. Many had similar stories of separation and hidden identities, creating an unexpected community of healing. "We're not alone," she told her father, as they watched these families explore the garden together. "Our story is part of something bigger." Richard nodded, emotion making his voice rough. "Your grandfather would be proud. His roses are helping people find their way home, just like they helped us." The youth program Sarah had envisioned was already thriving. Local schools brought students to learn about ecosystems and emotional growth, the garden becoming a living classroom for both environmental and personal development. "It's amazing," Sarah told her parents, as they watched a group of children learning about companion planting. They understand instinctively how everything's connected: plants, people, truth, growth. James smiled, seeing his own environmental passion blooming in his daughter. "That's the real legacy we're building here. Not just healing past wounds, but preventing future ones." Maxwell had fully embraced his new role as a champion of corporate responsibility. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund now included a branch specifically focused on supporting families affected by corporate misconduct, turning business resources toward healing communities. The quarterly reports look different these days, he joked with James. "We measure success in restored relationships rather than profit margins." The greenhouse had become a sanctuary for difficult conversations. Professional counselors worked alongside gardening therapists, creating programs that combined emotional and environmental healing. The Foster's Truth roses, blooming year-round in their special section, provided living metaphors for resilience and growth. Victoria's foundation had expanded its scope, now offering support to families worldwide who were working through similar journeys of truth and reconciliation. The garden served as both literal and metaphorical ground for these transformations. "When I first changed my name," she confided to a group of visitors, "I thought I was protecting myself. Now I understand that true protection comes from facing truth, not hiding from it." Sarah spent her weekends helping families plant their own memory gardens, small plots where they could cultivate both flowers and healing. Each family chose plants that held meaning for their journey, creating living stories of transformation. Elena's new book, Gardens of Truth, wove together these various stories of healing and hope. Each chapter explored different aspects of reconciliation, using the garden's spaces and plants as metaphors for the journey toward wholeness. "The thing about gardens," she wrote, "is that they teach us patience. Healing, like growth, can't be rushed. It needs time, attention, and the courage to keep tending hope, even when results aren't immediately visible." Thomas had trained a new generation of gardeners, passing on not just horticultural knowledge, but the deeper wisdom of growing healing spaces. His quiet guidance helped countless families find their way through difficult conversations and emotional breakthroughs. The Harrison Mansion, once a symbol of power and secrets, had become a beacon of hope. Its gates stood open to all seeking healing, its gardens offering space for truth to take root and grow. As summer began to transition into autumn, Sarah added another entry to her journal. "Sometimes the greatest healing happens not in grand moments of revelation, but in small acts of tending and care. Like a garden, family grows best when each member has room to bloom in their own way, while staying connected to shared roots of truth and love." The Foster's Truth roses continued to thrive, their unique blooms a reminder that beauty can emerge from even the most challenging circumstances. In their presence, families found courage to face their own histories, plant new possibilities, and nurture hope for future generations. 1 year after Sarah first arrived at the Harrison Mansion's gates, the estate hosted a special celebration. Families who had found healing in their gardens gathered to share their stories and plant new varieties of roses, each one named for their unique journeys toward truth and reconciliation. "Welcome home," Sarah greeted the visitors, now confident in her role as a bridge between past and present. The young girl who had once clutched a locket and hoped for answers had grown into a wise guide for others seeking their own truth. Elena's books had sparked a global movement, with similar healing gardens sprouting up around the world. The Harrison Foster model of combining environmental and emotional healing had proven remarkably successful, drawing attention from therapeutic communities and environmental organizations alike. "It's become something bigger than us," James told Elena as they watched families explore the gardens. "Bigger than our story." Victoria and Richard had developed a special program for children of families in transition, using the garden spaces to help young people understand and process change. Their own journey of reconciliation served as a powerful example of how truth could transform fear into strength. "Remember when we thought secrets would keep us safe?" Victoria asked her father, as they tended to the Fosters' truth roses. "Now we know it's truth that protects us, even when it's difficult." Maxwell had fully embraced his role as a champion of corporate responsibility and family healing. The Harrison Environmental Restoration Fund had expanded to include support for similar healing gardens worldwide, creating a network of spaces where truth could take root and grow. "The real profit," he often said, "is in watching families bloom again." Thomas and Margaret, though officially retired, remained vital presences in the garden. Their wisdom and experience helped guide new families through their own journeys of discovery and reconciliation. "Every flower has its season," Thomas would tell visitors, "just like every truth has its time to bloom." Sarah's youth program had grown into a full curriculum adopted by schools across the country. Young people learned about environmental stewardship alongside emotional intelligence, understanding how personal and planetary healing intertwined. "The garden teaches us everything we need to know," she explained to a group of students, about patience, about growth, about how healing happens in its own time. The greenhouse had become a living laboratory of hope, where the Fosters' truth roses continued to thrive and multiply. Each successful propagation was shared with new healing gardens around the world, carrying the legacy of truth and reconciliation to fresh soil. Eleanor finished her third book, Truth's Garden, which explored how the healing garden model had spread and evolved. "Sometimes," she wrote, "the most powerful changes start with a single act of courage, like a seed breaking through soil toward light." The Harrison mansion, once a fortress of secrets, now stood as a testament to love's transformative power. Its rooms echoed with laughter and honest conversations. Its gardens bloomed with stories of healing and hope. Victoria's foundation had created a scholarship program, helping children affected by family separation pursue education in environmental science and counseling. "We're growing the next generation of healers," she said proudly. As the celebration continued into evening, fairy lights twinkled in the gardens like earthbound stars. Families shared meals and stories, their children playing among the roses that bore witness to so many journeys of healing. Sarah found a quiet moment to write in her journal. "A year ago I thought I was searching for my father. Instead I found a whole garden of truth, a family that grows beyond blood, and a purpose bigger than myself. Every rose we plant here carries forward the legacy of courage, truth, and love that brought us all together." The night air filled with the sweet fragrance of roses as families gathered for the final event of the celebration, a candlelight ceremony in the healing garden. Each family held a lantern, their lights combining to illuminate the paths that had led them all to healing. "Truth like these lights," James addressed the gathering, "grows stronger when we share it. Each story of healing lights the way for others to find their path." Eleanor stood beside him, her books having touched countless lives. "When I started writing our story," she said, "I never imagined it would bloom into this garden of hope for so many." Victoria and Richard released butterflies among the Fosters' truth roses, their delicate wings catching the lantern light. "Like these butterflies," Victoria told the crowd, "we all emerge transformed when we embrace our true selves." Maxwell watched it all from the greenhouse steps, marveling at how his life's greatest achievement had nothing to do with business success. The real legacy of the Harrison name would be this garden of healing and the lives transformed within it. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah gathered with her parents beneath the arbor where their story had begun. The old locket and bracelet she wore caught the light of the moon, symbols of a journey that had led not just to truth, but to a whole new understanding of family and love. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best things grow from the smallest seeds of courage." The Harrison mansion stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its windows glowing with warm light. No longer a keeper of secrets, but a beacon of hope for all who sought healing through truth. And in the garden, the roses continued their eternal bloom, each flower a testament to the power of love to transform fear into courage, separation into connection, and endings into beautiful new beginnings.